Mr. Lewis, I wonder if you could just help me a little with one or two of the aspects of the evidence that you gave earlier on before lunch. As a general proposition, in a case of death after a police contact, is it better to put the PIRC flows in as soon as possible rather than put the Police Scotland flows in first and change to PIRC flows the next day?
In an ideal world, Lord, yes, that would be the ideal situation. However, there are investigations in the past and quite recently whereby there has been a police involvement as a result of a police investigation, and then as a result of that, the Crown have been made aware and instructed the PIRC to investigate. So there still is the occasion where Police Scotland flows are quite rightly deployed, because at that time it is specifically a police investigation. And then when the Crown Office receive the sudden death report, for example, they may look upon it as a need for us to become involved. So you still will have that overlap, if you like, in those circumstances. And I would suggest that the way we are now, more and more PIRC flows are in first, and it's only a minimal contact by Police Scotland prior to that.
The evidence before me is that on the 3rd of May 2015, Mr. Green from the Crown Office telephoned Mr. Harrower at about 9:35 on the morning of the 3rd, which was around about half an hour after Mr. Byers' life was pronounced extinct. So in this case, the PIRC were involved really from a very early stage. And what I'm trying to understand is why on that day the PIRC flows were not involved.
I don't know, but as I said, my lord, if I'd got the phone call, I could have turned out. So it's down to the logistics, etc. But at that, well, my information is that Police Scotland were deploying flows, and that's where your communication between our DSI at the time and the SIO within Police Scotland, that's their communication. From my point of view, yes, had I got the phone call, I could have turned out and been there by early afternoon at the latest.
Thank you very much. Ms. Thompson.
Thank you, sir. I wonder if we can bring the first of the flow logs back up on the screen, please. We've looked at the third page, which had the details of Ari Johnston as main contact and Colette Bell as secondary contact. If we can move on to the fourth page, please. This is headed up names of non-family members involved, e.g. solicitor amongst others. And the non-family member involved is named as Amar Anwar, and his contact details have been provided. Date first contacted the 4th of May 2015. Who provided you with Mr. Amar's details?
I think it was Addy by text.
And when was that?
I think it's in my log. I think it was probably around about. It would be in my log. I don't know if you can scroll down.
Well, we may come to that entry, so let's perhaps put that on the back burner. But what I was interested to know was whether this was information that you got at around about the time of the morning briefing, or whether it potentially is information that was provided at a later point in time, but it's been recorded at the front of the log because that's the place where you can record that sort of information.
Yeah. I was aware from that morning that Addy was in contact with the solicitor. I don't think at that time Mr. Anwar had been named, but I knew that was ongoing. And then, having spoken to Addy, I then got a text message with Mr. Anwar's contact details.
Okay, and that allowed you to populate that part of the form. Let's look at the next page, please. And if we can scroll up a little bit, we'll see at the very, very top, page 1. So this is the first page of the log proper. as it were. We've got the antecedent information, and from this point onwards, these are records of contacts with the family or the representatives. So let's look at this pro forma, because the following pages are all in identical terms, and then we'll look at the the content of it. So we see it's headed up contact sheet, Holmes incident number. What would that be?
That's more from a police point of view. Holmes is an IT system within police services that they can use to manage major incidents.
Victim is Sheko Bio. Then there's an entry where you can identify the person contacted, the method of contact, personal, telephone, letter or other, the date and time of contact. Then there's a record of the actual content of the contact. And if we scroll to the very bottom of the page, we'll see that there is a place where the officer making the entry can sign and date and time the entry. There's some information there that allows you to call the Holmes receiver. Is that relevant for our purposes?
No.
Okay. So having looked at the shape of the pro forma, let's go back up and look at the content of it. So it's dated the 4th of May, if we can scroll up just a little bit. 4th of May, but there isn't a time. But it reads, the now deceased was born in Sierra Leone, 3983. He resides with his partner Colette Bell and a young baby at their address at Aaron Crescent. About 7:10, I think that says, perhaps 15?
7:15.
7:15 hours on Sunday, 3rd of May 2015. Police Scotland received several telephone calls regarding a black male in possession of a knife, chasing cars on Hayfield Road, Hendry Road, Kirkcaldy. Several police officers responded from Kirkcaldy Police Office. As police officers attended Hayfield Road, they observed the male in possession of a knife approaching them. Police officers drew police batons and CS Pava spray. A struggle then ensued, and the deceased was taken to the ground and handcuffed to the rear. While still on the ground, about 7:30 hours, one or more officers noticed the now deceased had lost consciousness. An ambulance was summoned and the police officers attempted CPR. Paramedics arrived at 07:32 and conveyed the now deceased to Kirkcaldy Victoria Hospital. There were no apparent injuries, and medical staff continued to treat the deceased in the resuscitation room. Life was pronounced extinct at 09:04 hours and transferred a short time later to a side room at A&E, where police officers stood by him. Police Scotland thereafter implemented full forensic procedures relative to the seizure of police officer uniforms, securing the incident scene and recovery of evidence productions. DSI Harrower spoke with family 3515, advised family SPOC Addie Johnston regarding the need for a PM. This was refused regarding formal identification, as mother was travelling from England with family elders. So I'm going to ask you some questions about the content, but before we do that, let's scroll down just a little bit further to the bottom of that page. It appears to have been written up at 2 p.m. on the 5th of May. Is that right?
Yes.
The information that's recorded in this first entry, which spans 3 pages of the log, where did that information come from?
That was the briefing paper I had that morning. What I tried to do when I'm deployed as a flow is, if there's a briefing paper, to have a quick reference, I'll put that as basically the first entry. So if I need to refer to it, rather than searching through IT systems or anything else, I can find it. I know exactly where to find it.
Now that briefing was at 9 o'clock on the morning of
Yes.
the 4th. This entry's been written up at 2 o'clock on the afternoon of the 5th.
Yes.
Did you have a copy of the briefing paper, or did you write this from memory?
No, it was a copy.
Why wasn't it written up at the time?
My priority on the 4th was to make contact with the family and establish more detail and more circumstances. So the 5th, at that time, the time we dealt with other inquiries, that was my sort of first opportunity to sit down and take that time to start my flow log, and as I say, start with the briefing paper.
Can we go back to the first of those 3 pages? I think it's page 4 of the PDF. I think, in fact, it was page 5, I'm sorry. And if we scroll to the bottom of that page, we see here the bottom 4 lines: as police officers attended Hayfield Road, they observed the male in possession of a knife approaching them. Police officers drew batons and CS Pava spray. And we're on to the next page now. A struggle then ensued. So this is information that you say came from the briefing that morning and from
Yes.
the briefing paper. Let's have a look at the briefing paper, please. It's PIRC 03694. And Mr. Harrower has confirmed to us that this was the paper that he produced on the 3rd of May. So we see it stated the 3rd of May, briefing note for Director of Investigations, Death and Police Custody of Shekobayo. Background information. Now, if we could scroll down to the second page of this document, 3 or 4 paragraphs down. Perfect. So we see here in the background section, it is recorded, it was reported that as the officers drove into Hayfield Road, they saw the now deceased coming towards them as the vehicles came to a halt. They could clearly see he was in possession of a knife and making his way towards them. Some of the officers, unknown how many at this stage, drew their police-issue batons. At least one of the officers also drew their Pava spray and issued a warning to the now deceased, who continued to come forward. Pava was subsequently sprayed towards the now deceased. However, this had little effect, and there is some reference to him laughing at the officers. It was also reported that one of the female officers was apparently kicked in the back, but also sustained a blow to the back of her head. She sustained no serious injury as a result, but complained of pain. As the Pava had little effect, a number of the officers struck the now deceased with their batons. It is unknown at present how often he was struck or how many officers struck him. A struggle then ensues, and the now deceased was eventually taken to the ground, where he was handcuffed to the rear. Due to his constant struggling, leg restraints were also applied to him. Is that familiar to you?
Not that document, no. There is information there that I'm aware of, but not that particular document, no.
So this is not the briefing document that you were shown on the 3rd of May?
No, mine's what I've written into the flow log. That was what I had to hand.
Oh, I see. So you have copied verbatim into your flow log?
From memory, yeah, it was a A4 sheet I had, I think, from memory, and I copied that in.
I see. That must be my mistake. I'm sorry. I had understood that perhaps you had incorporated a summary of what was in this briefing note.
No.
Bear with me just a second. I'm being reminded that Mr. Harrower confirmed in his evidence yesterday that this was the document that formed the basis for the briefing that he gave on the morning of the 4th, along with his operational notes. But that, to the best of your recollection, this wasn't a document that was provided to you at the time.
I don't remember getting that document with that amount of detail into it. But had I got that, I would have. I'm confident I would have put all of that into the first few pages of the flow log.
All right. In any event, the information that you recorded, I'm sorry, if we can jump back to the log, please. Thank you. We see that the information that you have recorded is that when the officers attended Hayfield Road, they observed the male, who we now know to be Shekobayo, in possession of a knife and approaching them. Is that right?
Yes.
And that the officers drew their batons and CS and Pava spray.
Yes.
And a struggle ensued. Did you understand the information that was provided to you, and which you've copied into your log, to be accurate at the time it was given to you?
At the time it was given to me, yes.
And if we look at the information provided, if we scroll up just a little bit again, please. The officers observed Shekobayo, or the male, in possession of a knife, approaching them, they drew their batons and their CS and Pava spray. Was that information suggestive to you that Mr. Bayo was the aggressor here and the police were responding to the situation before them?
I didn't look at that as an aggressor. I looked upon that as a briefing paper, as to what that, as it was a briefing paper. It was I was keeping an open mind as to what had happened prior to that and what had happened right there and then. So I wouldn't put him as the aggressor for my putting a name to it. It's an incident whereby there has been an interaction between Sheku and the police officers who attended.
But you understood that account of events to be accurate at the time that it was provided?
As far as the briefing paper was concerned, yes, that was what the information was at hand at that time.
If we can scroll to the very end of that entry, so it's the third page of that entry. Final paragraph. DSI Harrower spoke with the family 3515, advised family SPOC, is that single point of contact?
Yes.
Addie Johnson regarding the need for a PM. This was refused regarding formal identification as mother was travelling from England with family elders. So you've explained that you understood that Addie was the single point of contact for
Yes.
the family. Now, how was it established that Addie was the single point of contact?
Excuse me, that was from Keith Harrower, that he was a single point of contact.
So Keith Harrower advised you
Yes.
that Addie was the single point of contact? And were the PIRC satisfied that he was the single point of contact for the entire family?
At that time, yes. As I said earlier, I'm sure he was aware of the family consulting with, as it turned out to be, Mr. Anmar at that time as well.
And what about Colette Bell? Were the PIRC satisfied that Addie had authority to speak on her behalf, that she had consented to him being single point of contact on her behalf?
I'm not aware of whether Colette was spoken to by PIRC staff on the 3rd. But my understanding was that until I'd clarified things myself, that Addie was the single point of contact for the family.
And what steps did you take to clarify things yourself?
That was in the Monday morning. I wanted to clarify the identification with the family if possible, and to confirm with them that he was the single point of contact. And throughout that day, that was my contact details, was with Addie, his telephone number.
We'll maybe revisit that issue as we go through the log. That might be easier than jumping around within the different entries. But as far as you understood things, when you were appointed as Flo on the 4th of May, Addie was the single point of contact for the family.
Yes, and he was seeking advice from a solicitor, so I was aware of that as well.
What were your expectations of a single point of contact?
Again, that is, until you actually speak to that person and establish the parameters. At that time, he was, as it is in the title, a single point of contact. He was the person I had to speak to on behalf of the family, and I was going to be his spoke for the PIRC organisation.
You said earlier in your evidence before the lunch adjournment that you would anticipate the single point of contact cascading information. You would need to feel confident that they were going to cascade information to the family. Is that the sort of discussion that you would have at the point where you were introduced to the single point of contact?
Yes.
So setting parameters?
It's setting parameters. It's having the confidence. It's having the confidence. There's no, until you progress the investigation and have anything to suggest that's not been done, then I had no reason to doubt that Addie would not pass on any information to the family, so I was confident that he was going to do that.
Now, this entry refers to the need for a post-mortem. Had anything been said at the morning briefing about the arrangements for the post-mortem?
The family had refused formal identification.
Was that discussed at the briefing?
Just as it was formal identification had been refused, and that the post-mortem was going ahead with the, as per Crown instructions.
And do you know what the Crown instructions were in terms of the arrangements for the post-mortem?
I knew it was going ahead on the 4th, I think. It was about lunchtime, I don't know the exact time.
Do you recall what you were told at the briefing about the family's refusal regarding formal identification?
That's what I was told, refused formal identification because there was family, Sheku's mother and others, extended members of the family travelling from England and elsewhere to the family home.
And did you understand why it was that the fact that his mother was travelling from England would prevent family here in Scotland from carrying out the identification?
I couldn't understand, and that's why, that morning I was wanting to speak to Addy just to clarify what the circumstances of that was and if there was any reason or any way that I could assist in resolving that issue.
I'd like you to look at Caddy Johnston's statement, which is SBPI 00236. At paragraph 11, please. I'm asked if we had any further engagement with Police Scotland that evening. This is the 3rd of May. They did say that a family liaison officer will come. Somebody came after that. I believe maybe it was a family liaison officer. But I remember another person coming to the house that it was quite late. When he came in, he said we should go and identify the body. I said to him, no. I said, my mum is in London. I'll arrange for her to come the next day, and when she comes, we'll go and identify the body. That's what I said to him. Do you have any comment on that?
I'm not aware of the detail of that, but I was aware of Keith Harrow speaking to Caddy on the morning of the 4th as well, by telephone, but that information in that detail, no. All I knew at the time on the Monday was that the family had refused formal identification and family were travelling from England.
I mean, what Caddy says in her statement essentially is not that there was a refusal to identify point blank, but that the family would identify when the mother made it to Scotland from England.
That's correct, yeah.
Does that come as news to you?
It is, yes. That detail, yes.
Okay,
And as I said earlier, I think it's probably the first time I've had any kind of, a family refuse identification, so I saw that as a priority as to, as I said earlier, can I resolve that? Is it something that I can resolve and revisit on behalf of the family and, again, the communication between the organisation and the family?
I'm going to read to you a passage from Caddy's evidence. Again, this won't come up on the screen because it's from our transcript. This particular paragraph, she was taken to this paragraph in her evidence in the same way as I've taken you to certain paragraphs, then asked some questions. She was taken to that paragraph and then she was asked, did you make it clear to that person, who I think we now know was Keith Harrower, that you would go the next day once Jeku's mother was in Kirkcaldy? And she replied, I told them that our mum was coming on the next day and we can arrange to see the body then. Yes. And when you explained to the person you think is the PIRC, the family liaison officer, that Sheku's mum would be travelling up the next day, did you make it clear that you would be willing to identify the body once she had arrived in Scotland? Yes, it was clear that we will identify the body once my mum is here. That was made clear. Again, would you wish to comment on that at all?
I was not aware of that conversation, and from a family liaison point of view, had I known that was the situation, I could have facilitated that on the Monday with conversations with senior management or the Crown.
I'd like to take you to Mr. Harrower's inquiry statement now, which is SBPI 00259, paragraph 55. After explaining to the family regarding the PIRC role and function, I then advised the family that COPFS had made arrangements for a post-mortem examination on the afternoon of Monday 4 May. I asked for 2 family members to make themselves available to attend the City Mortuary in Edinburgh to identify the body. My operational notes at page 9 state that, it's a quote, Addy stated the family had discussed matters and no representatives were willing to do the identification until family members, including the now deceased's mother, attended. She was travelling with a group, including elders from England. My understanding of this was that the family were refusing to do the identification in the timescale outlined. I don't think it was the intention that it would be the mother that would do the identification, but that they were not willing to participate in that process until she arrived. I'm aware she was travelling from down south or was about to travel. I don't have any recollection of being advised as to when she would arrive. I got the impression she was in the process of travelling, but I don't think established where she was actually coming from, other than it was somewhere in England. I think it was suggested that they would arrive at some time the following day, which was the Monday, and obviously the post-mortem was arranged for midday on the Monday. I've been asked if the family understood that it was the Crown's decision as to the timing of the post-mortem. Yes, I think so. I'd explained specifically it was the Crown's decision. My statement records that Mr Johnson wasn't willing to be more specific on the expected arrangements of the arrival of the family members, etc. That part of the conversation was closed down. So it's very much a matter for the chair, but it would seem to be that there isn't really a conflict between Caddy's evidence and Mr Harbour's evidence, and that he accepts that the family were not refusing outright to identify Sheku's body, but they wanted that process to be delayed until his mother had arrived from England. You're nodding. Would you agree with that interpretation?
Now that I'm aware of that and that information, I don't see that as a refusal. I see that as the family expressing their involvement in what they can and cannot do, and that would be part of my role. Again, hindsight's a wonderful thing, but had I been involved in the Sunday, then I'm confident that we could have arranged something to facilitate the family's wishes.
You said earlier in your evidence, I think after we looked at Caddy's evidence, but before I took you to Mr Harrower's evidence, had I known, I could have facilitated that on the Monday with conversations with, and I think you said senior management or
Yes.
the Crown. I'm finding it difficult to follow the transcript
Okay,
at the same
all right.
time as taking your evidence. So help us to understand what might you have been able to do had you appreciated when you came on duty and were appointed as a flow early on Monday, the 4th of May. Had you appreciated then that the family had not refused to perform formal identification, but that they were asking effectively for that process to be delayed, what would you have done?
Again, I would have raised it with senior management and asked them to liaise with, on this occasion, Dave Green, to, if that was the case, that it had to go ahead at that time, then I would need some form of explanation to provide the family, to explain those circumstances and the rationale behind that.
Which family members did you understand had refused to perform the identification?
I don't think it was this. I'm not aware of any specific person or member of the family saying, no, I can't do it. It's a formal identification, obviously, prior to the post-mortem, but it doesn't need to be the family. If the family didn't want to do it and they nominated 2 people who had known Sheku, then, again, I would have facilitated that, even to the point of, which we've done in the past, is transporting family members to the post-mortem and facilitating that request. So, again, as I said, that morning, I wanted to understand more about why this had become as a refusal, as it was at the time, but unfortunately, I didn't get that chance to make that communication with Addy. So, and again, on the Sunday, it would have been challenging to arrange, if they wanted identification on the Sunday, just to the logistics of it, but it would have been explored, or I would have explored it to assist the family.
Can we bring the log up again, please? Just to remind ourselves of exactly what's said in the entry, this is the information that was provided to you. You said all of this information came from a briefing note,
Yeah.
is that right? And not the one I thought it was
No.
an A4 sheet. Did that include the bit that we've looked at the end of that entry, please? Page 3 of that entry. Final paragraph. DSI Harrower spoke with family, advised family SPOC Addie Johnson regarding the need for PM. This was refused regarding formal identification, etc. Was that information written down in the briefing note that was
No, I
provided
think
to you?
I'm not 100% certain, but I think that's more of a conversation I had with DSI Harrow. He was telling me that there was a refusal.
So it said that DSI Harrower had confirmed that Addie said that there was a refusal regarding formal identification. And I'm wondering what your understanding was at that point in time about Colette Bell's attitude towards identifying Sheku's body.
Again, that information hadn't been provided to me. It was Addie was the point of contact, and as I said earlier, my priority was to speak to the family to ascertain the full circumstances, or to get more detail about the circumstances, and to assist in the formal identification.
So the reference here is to DSI Harrower speaking with the family on the 3rd of May. And we've heard his evidence this week, as I've mentioned, and he gave evidence that he had gone to the Johnstons' home on the evening of the 3rd, and that's where this conversation took place. He was asked, do you remember Colette Bell being present? And he replied, no. Or her mother? And he replied, I wouldn't have known, I wouldn't have been able to identify either of them at that stage. He was then asked, did you have a conversation about the post-mortem with Colette Bell at a separate time? And he replied, no. Can I invite your comment on that evidence?
I couldn't comment on who remembers being there. I wasn't there for that family meeting. I don't really know what you want me to.
That's my fault. If the question wasn't clear, that's entirely my fault. What I'm getting at is this. Addie Johnston has, in the context of a meeting with DSI Harrower, apparently refused formal identification on behalf of the family. DSI Harrower couldn't remember whether Colette Bell had been party to that meeting, said he wouldn't have recognised her if she had been there. So I'm wondering whether you had any understanding at that time, this is the morning of the 4th, as to what Colette Bell's position was in relation to identification of the body.
On the 4th, no, I wasn't aware of any requests or any information regarding that.
I'd like to read to you another chapter from Colette Bell's evidence. Again, this won't come up on the screen. But she gave evidence that she'd provided a statement to police officers on the morning of the 3rd of May, very shortly after the death message had been delivered to her. And she said in her evidence, I said, I don't want to give you a statement, I want to see Shek. And they had said, that they understood it was difficult, but it was really important to try and get the statement so that they could get all the information that they needed to find out what had happened. And I had said, no, I just want to see Shek. I just want to see Shek. And I remember saying it over and over again. I don't want to do anything. I just want to see Shek. And they had said, if you get the statement done, then we will see about you going to see him. And she was asked by senior counsel, so having heard that, what was your understanding of the position? And she replied, well, I thought I'll do the statement and then I'll get to see him. They've said that he would need to be identified anyway, and they had said, you will get to see him. So if you get your statement done, you'll get to see him, because he needs to be identified anyway, because they had explained that he would probably need a post-mortem, I think, at that stage. She later in her evidence went on to say that she recalled on the 3rd of May staying up really, really late, obviously upset, but I kept thinking, why have they not contacted me to go and see him? And I remember saying to my mum, I thought they were going to phone me to go and see Sheik. And then I was like, but I don't have a number to get in contact with them. Surely they'll just get in contact with us, because I had made it very, very clear to them that I wanted to see him. Can I invite your comment on that evidence?
That's a statement she gave to Police Scotland officers, is that correct?
She had given a statement to police officers on the morning of the 3rd, and she'd been asked about the giving of that statement in her oral evidence here before the inquiry. And she then went on to narrate the conversation that she said she'd had with them in the aftermath, or during the course really of giving her statement, about wanting to see Sheku's body. And she said that she had been reassured that if she gave the statement, then yes, she would be able to see the body.
I'm not aware of the circumstance of why Police Scotland would want that statement as urgently as that. There may well have been an operational decision from that point of view, but to view, again, hindsight's a wonderful thing, but had myself been involved as a flow, then it may well have presented logistical issues in relation to viewing Sheku, but I would have done my very best to, at the very least, try and get it done that night, if not as early as the following morning.
So can I take it then that the chapter of her evidence that I've just shared with you again comes as news to you, and that you had been unaware that Colette had wanted to identify her partner's body?
Yes.
Okay. And again, if you had known that when you were appointed as a flow on the morning of the 4th, what would you have done?
As I said earlier, I'd have made it a priority. The formal identification would then be complete. If Colette and her mum, for example, wanted to do that, or another member of the family, so that would have been effectively a job done, and then we could have arranged, depending on what the family wanted, a additional viewing. But as I say, I wasn't aware of that issue in relation to the family.
I'd like to read to you one final chapter from Colette's evidence. She was asked by senior counsel what impact it had had on her not being able to see Sheku before the autopsy took place. And she said, really bad. I think because I didn't get to say goodbye, I didn't get to see him. Even now, I think maybe they still got it wrong. Like, I know they didn't get it wrong. I know it was Shek. But I often find myself thinking, maybe they did get it wrong. Maybe it wasn't actually him. I often have nightmares and things about it, that I'll be walking down a beach on holiday and Shek will be coming towards me. And I think it's just I didn't have that closure, and I didn't have that time to say goodbye, because it was so sudden, and then not being able to see him has had a massive impact on me. Could I ask for your comment on that?
I fully understand that her feelings and her emotion, and probably anger as well. All I can say is, had I known that, had I been involved at an earlier stage, I would have facilitated that request with ease, but it would have been done.
You said that in order to facilitate that request, and similarly, if you had appreciated at the time that Caddy and her family simply wanted to await their mother's arrival from England before identifying the body, you said that part of that process of facilitation would involve speaking with senior management. Who would that have been within your organisation?
That would be, well, on this occasion it was Billy Little, who was the DSI, and John McSporn, and if need be, John Mitchell, the Director of Operations, to liaise with Dave Green.
So you would have expected them to liaise with Dave Green directly?
If I was involved in that situation, I would. If the family, the refusal, I'd be looking to, as I said, to clarify that, and if the Crown were insisting that post-mortem had to go ahead at that time, I would need to have something to give the family back from an information point of view. I wouldn't accept the fact of going back and saying, well, the Crown has said. It's all about communication with the family, so had I been aware of that, I would have progressed it to as high a level as possible and to get an answer.
And what would you have hoped would have been the outcome of senior management speaking with Dave Green?
I would like to think positively that, and from a confident point of view, that explaining the full circumstances, that we could have accommodated the family's wishes.
And what impact might that have had on the timing of the autopsy?
Again, I would need to, speaking to Addy as to what's the timescale we're looking at. Bearing in mind, you have family travelling up from England to Kirkcaldy, to then expect them to turn round and go straight back down to Edinburgh Mortuary. I think that would be, it'd be unacceptable to expect that of them. But if that was their wish and they were willing to do that, then if that meant we had to transport all the family members to negate the need for them to drive that distance and take them back home, I could have done that. That could have been arranged. I've done it before many, many times. So, excuse me, again, just going back, I've been aware of the full circumstances. I would have accommodated that.
And would you have expected your senior managers, whether it was Mr Little, Mr McSporran or Mr Mitchell, in their liaison with Dave Green, to have explored the possibility of delaying the start of the post-mortem?
If I was aware of the full circumstances, I would be surprised if something couldn't be done. And again, if it couldn't be done, I would need to have some form of answer, not just, it's not happening, it's going ahead now. There would need to be some rationale behind that.
Thank you. Can we go back to the flow log, please? And it's page 9 of the PDF. So this is the next entry. I'm going to take you through, I think, every entry from the 4th of May. And this is the next one. And the contact date and time are 10:40 hours on the 4th of the 5th. And it's a personal contact with DSI Little, who we have heard was appointed as the Deputy Senior Investigator on the 4th of May. Is that right?
Yes.
Let's look at the entry. Flow meeting with DSI William Little and Investigator John Clarkin, flow strategy. Provided with an overview of the investigation, requested to make contact with the immediate family, introduce the PIRC flows, contact numbers, etc. Responsible for the following tasks: to obtain relevant background details of the family members and the victim, act as a consultant to the family in respect of legal procedures, act as a consultant to the family in respect of PIRC procedures, to ensure the family receive appropriate information, to advise the family of the progress of the investigation, to advise the family of the existence and role of appropriate support agencies and how to contact them, to acquire and document all evidence relating to the family and people associated with it. And again, we see at the bottom that this entry was written up at 1500 hours the following day, so again more than 24 hours later. But I think we saw that the previous entry had been written up at 2 o'clock on the afternoon of the 5th. So can we take it that there were simply no entries written up before 2 o'clock on the 5th?
Yeah, that's correct.
What does this entry that we've just looked at relate to? There's a reference in there to flow strategy. I'm just wondering what the entry, what it is. Is it a summary of tasks that you were given that corresponded to the flow strategy?
Yeah, basically it's a excuse me, it's an overview of, as it said there, of what is expected of me, and the contact to make with the family, and the basics of family liaison with a single point of contact.
We'll return to this in a moment, but can we jump back to the policy document, please? And if we can look at page 7 of the PDF. Role of the senior investigator, family liaison strategy. It is essential that prior to any flow deployment, the SI has formulated a family liaison strategy. The strategy should set out the objectives for the liaison between the family and the investigation and are the basis for tasking the flow. These objectives should include gathering material from the family, obtaining victimology, keeping the family updated on the progress of the investigation, ensuring the investigation is not compromised by the disclosure of untrammelled information, and police and family media strategy. And if we can also look at the top of the next page, please. top of page 8. Flows should be fully aware of the aims and objectives of their deployment prior to meeting with the family and should have sight of the family liaison strategy document. Any uncertainties on the part of the flow should be discussed with the SI before meetings with the family or victim occur. Now, in your second inquiry statement, we don't need to go to it, but the reference is paragraph 61. You say, I think John McSporran actually wrote up a more detailed flow strategy. I might be wrong on that. And so I'm interested to know whether you had sight of a family liaison strategy document which the policy suggests should be made available to the flow.
Not a written one by John McSporran, no.
Do you have anything beyond the entry in the flow log that we've just looked at?
From a written copy? No. No.
And what the entry in the log that we looked at a moment ago, is that in effect the family liaison strategy or a summary of it?
It's a summary of it, and it gave, it's the early days of the investigation. And because of my experience in married flow deployments, I knew what my job was, I knew what I had to get, and I knew the priority and the importance of getting that information. So, excuse me, from a personal point of view, all I really needed was an overview of what I basically knew I had to do. And it was bad. Then again, going back to the post-mortem, on the actual day, I didn't hang about at Hamilton Police Office. I felt it was more of a more priority to me to be up in Kirkcaldy, just in case the family wanted to speak to me, any member of the family, so that I was nearby. So I knew what my job was, I knew what I had to do, and as far as a written strategy, no, I've never seen one.
Given your experience, did you feel at a disadvantage, given that you didn't have a written strategy?
No. If I'd had any concerns whatsoever, I'd have gone back to Billy or John McSporran, depending on the information I had, and have no fear of raising any concerns.
Can we go back to the entry that we were looking at a moment ago, the entry that is a summary of the strategy in the flow log? It's log page 5, so it will be another 2 pages further on. Thank you. And if we scroll down, I want to just ask you to explain some of the tasks that you've summarised here. Responsible for the following tasks. You say to obtain relevant background details of the family members and the victim. That's perhaps self-explanatory. If we look towards the bottom of the page, to ensure the family receive appropriate information, can you explain what that means?
In general, it's feeding the information to the family, liaising with them and give them an update as to how the investigation is progressing. But again, at the same time, it's a live investigation, and you explained from the outset, they may well ask a question that I cannot answer, or it would be improper for me to answer because of we are reporting to the Crown. And just because we send the report to the Crown, that's not the end of the investigation. The Crown Office could quite easily come back and instruct further actions of the organisation. So it's maintaining the appropriate information to the family so that they know that the investigation is progressing and how it's progressing. But at the same time, there's information that I would possibly not divulge them to maintain the integrity.
And the next bullet point is to advise the family on the existence and role of appropriate support agencies and how to contact them.
Yes.
Can you say a little more about that?
Well, over the years, you gain a lot of experience of different organisations. I think you have to make it quite clear that as a family liaison officer, you're not a counsellor. I've no training in that whatsoever. I have experience of providing information to families in relation to counselling. That might be as straightforward as contacting their local GP in their local area. If for any reason I thought it was appropriate and needed to find local contact information for them from a counselling point of view, I would research that locally to find that, and if need be, introduce them, which I've done in the past, to those people. But I cannot, you understand, it's not for me to tell families to go and speak to these people. I can only provide that information, and as I say, you have that wealth of information from your own experience, but if I didn't know anything about it, I know where I could go and get it. An example, if we go back to the meetings with Flows about the repatriation of bodies to another country, if I did not know how to do that, I knew where to go and get that information to provide that and to assist the family. So it's not a case of being a counsellor, it's a case of I can help you and I can get you. That's my support role. I can provide you with the information.
So a signposting role, essentially.
Effectively, yes.
Yeah. And the family liaison policy, we don't need to bring it up on the screen, but the reference would be page 31. It contains includes a section on support services, and there are some appendices to that policy that provide details of various support agencies, including Compassionate Friends, Cruise,
Yes.
Petal. Are these all organisations that you know about?
Yes.
Are they organisations that you have signposted families to in the past?
In the past, yes. I think, moving forward, I think it was probably 2016, 2017, I had a more active role in the flow policy, and in order to keep it updated, it was to remove some of those organisations because sometimes it wasn't appropriate for that organisation to be involved. So removing it from the policy, removing it from leaflets, but at the same time having that ability to provide that support role, as you say, signpost them in the right direction.
And some of these are national organisations,
Yes.
but you spoke about having local knowledge as well?
Yeah, you have, if there might well be a national organisation that can assist the family, and it may well be contacting that national organisation to try to identify a local branch that can assist them. Or if, invariably, if you speak to these organisations, they'll quite openly tell you, no, I can't assist, but I know somebody who can, or an organisation who can. So again, you're getting that support role and have the ability to provide that to any family in relation to whatever it is.
And are these the sorts of inquiries that you might make on behalf of a family member, to call the national helpline to find out if there's a local branch, rather than simply handing the family the telephone number for the...
If you can, these leaflets serve a purpose, but if family said, no, I don't want to do that, but can you do that for me? I have no issues with that. That's what the company phone's for, making those phone calls.
Can we move on to the next entry, please? It's the next page, please. So if we scroll up just a little bit, other way, please. Contact date and time haven't been completed here, but I think as we read in, we'll find that there's a timestamp within the entry itself. So let's look at this entry and then I'll ask you some questions about it. Provided with a family update regarding formal identification, as this had been refused by the family, 3515 DSI Harrower again contacted the family SPOC Addie Johnston. DSI Harrower spoke with Addie Johnston 10:30 hours, 4th of the 5th, in my presence. He confirmed family not willing to attend PM for formal identification, confirmed to Addie Johnston that Crown directed post-mortem to go ahead as planned, asked to attend and introduce Flows, morning of the 4th. Addie Johnston stated he was in consultation with a solicitor who would contact PIRC on behalf of the family. DSI Harrower thereafter called back and left a voicemail message with flow details and contact number. Also phoned and spoke to Caddy on landline, details also left with Caddy regarding contact details. So, as I noted, the time of the contact hasn't been written up, but there's a reference to you being present during a call that Mr Harrower made at 10:30 on the morning of the 4th, which provides a timestamp
Yes.
for this particular event. Now, the previous entry that we looked at a moment ago related to your meeting with Mr Little at 10:40, and I wonder which happened first. because either the entries are out of sequence or one of the timings must be incorrect.
I can't remember. May well have had a meeting with Billy and then Keith making that phone call or vice versa. I can't remember, to be.
It may not matter. They're only 10 minutes apart. And if we scroll to the bottom of that page, please, we see that the date and time that the entry has been made has also not been completed here. But given that the previous entry was written up at 3 o'clock on the 5th, would it be reasonable to assume that this entry must have been written up after 3 o'clock on the 5th?
It's probably is reasonable, yes.
Okay. And again, that's more than 24 hours after.
Yes.
You explain in your statement, we don't need this on the screen, but it's your second statement, paragraph 55, as a reference, that you were sitting beside Keith Harrower when he made the call and you just heard, as you put it, the one-sided
Yes.
version. So should we understand that to mean that Mr. Harrower was on the phone to Addie Johnston?
Yes.
Wasn't on loudspeaker?
No.
He was simply making a call and you could hear what Mr. Harrower was saying, but not what Mr. Johnston
That's
was saying.
correct, yes.
How is it that you know that Addie confirmed the family were not willing to attend the PM for formal identification? Was that based on what you heard of the call or on something that Mr. Harrower said to you afterwards?
It'd be afterwards, him confirming that.
And you have recorded that Keith Harrower told Addie that the PM was to go ahead as planned. Again, was that something you heard Mr. Harrower say, or was that something that he confirmed to you afterwards?
I heard him say that, yes.
Okay. And the plan was for the post-mortem to take place that day about lunchtime?
If I understand, I can't remember the exact time, but I think it was around about lunchtime that day.
And what was your understanding as to the family's knowledge of the arrangements for the post-mortem?
Only what Keith Harrower told me that it was going ahead as per Crown instructions.
And again, what about Colette? To your knowledge, had anyone contacted her that morning to discuss the post-mortem arrangements with her?
Not to my knowledge, no. I certainly didn't do it. I was, again, going back to what I said earlier, it was a priority to me. I couldn't understand that concept of a refusal. That's the first time any family has refused to identify their loved one, so I wanted to know more about that and I wanted to make inquiries in relation to that. Unfortunately, I was not successful.
And it was during this call that Mr. Harrower asked to visit the family and introduce the family liaison officers.
Yes.
And Addie said that he was with a solicitor who would be in touch
Yes.
on the family's behalf. I wonder if we can return to the family liaison policy and look at page 24 of the PDF. There's a section here headed Viewing and Identification of the Body. The FLO will have a crucial role to play in the identification process of the deceased. Close liaison with the SI and Procurator Fiscal concerning the issues of viewing, identification and body release must be undertaken by the FLO. I'm wondering what liaison you had with the senior investigator in relation to identification and what liaison you had with the Fiscal in relation to identification.
At that time, there was no liaison with me specifically. Again, going back to what we discussed, is that the family, my information was the family had refused, and that was a priority for me, is to establish more detail regarding that, and then I would have hopefully been in a better position to come back and then speak to the senior investigator and request a consultation with either a senior management or, if need be, to have a one-to-one or a conversation between myself and the Procurator Fiscal, or Dave Green, as it was on this occasion, to put across the family's request and provide more information.
Thank you. Can you bear with me a moment? I'm mindful of the hour, sir.
We'll take a 15-minute break. Ms. Thompson.
Thank you. We were looking at the policy document, and it was the section headed Viewing and Identification of the Body, which is on page 24 of the PDF. We've looked at the top, the first two paragraphs. If I might read on from there. It must be recognised that the formal identification procedure and viewing of the body are separate processes. The formal identification will form an essential element of the post-mortem process. Formal visual identification of a body may not always be possible due to the injury sustained or decomposition of the remains. The SI, in liaison with the Procurator Fiscal, will decide what processes will be employed to establish the identity of the deceased, especially if they are invasive, mutilate or use DNA. When other forms of identification are to be undertaken, for example, fingerprints, dental charting or DNA profiling, the process and reasons for it must be explained in an open and honest manner by the flow whenever possible. Now, returning to the morning of the 4th of May, Mr. Lewis, I understand that the information available to you at that point in time was that the family had refused to identify Mr. Bio's body. And I wonder, what was your understanding as to the alternative arrangements that had been made to identify the body?
I think it was police officers who had done the formal identification. Not 100% certain of that, but there had been some form of formal identification to satisfy the Crown.
Okay. I don't think we have the post-mortem report on today's playlist. I'll be corrected if I'm wrong, but I believe that the post-mortem report confirms that formal identification was by way of fingerprints in combination with two officers.
Yeah, that's now that you say that, yes, it was fingerprints and two police officers, I think, yes.
So were you aware on the 4th of May, on the morning of the 4th of May, before the post-mortem took place, that identification was going to be by fingerprints, given what you understood the family's position to be at that time?
I think I found out about that later. The formal identification from memory was two police officers, and then at a later time, which I can't remember, that fingerprints had also been involved as well.
Okay. So should I understand that on the morning of the 4th, you were unaware that there was an arrangement for the identification to take place by fingerprint?
No, I was aware that there'd been formal identification. I just couldn't remember exactly what it was.
Would you have known about it at the time and you've forgotten it with the passage of time? Or on the 4th, did you understand it to be two officers and you later found out about fingerprinting?
I think I could only say that I knew that formal identification had been done to satisfy the Crown. The actual details of that, I couldn't say right there on the 4th as to knowing that knowledge.
Okay. So you may not have known on the 4th what the process was going to be.
That's correct.
The policy provides that when other forms of identification are to be undertaken, the process and reasons for it must be explained in an open and honest manner by the flow whenever possible. Although it would surely follow that the flow would have to know what the alternative process was going to be before the flow could offer any explanation to a family. And your evidence is that you didn't know the detail of it on the 4th. Did you take any steps to ascertain what alternative form of identification was going to be used in advance of the post-mortem going ahead at lunchtime?
No, as I said, my understanding was going ahead at lunchtime, and my priority from the very outset that morning was to get to Kirkcaldy and just see if I could do anything to assist in formal identification from the family's point of view.
The policy speaks to the flow having a crucial role to play in the identification process of the deceased. And I wonder whether you were concerned at the time as to whether the opportunity for you to play a crucial role in the identification process was undermined by the fact that it was 10:30 in the morning or thereabouts, and the post-mortem was due to take place at lunchtime, and you still hadn't had the opportunity to speak with the family?
I don't know about undermined it, but certainly it created a challenge that I don't think needed to be there. The time constraints available at that time was challenging, of that there's no doubt. And again, it's going back to early contact with the family, whether that been the Sunday or even earlier in the Monday morning. Is there something I could have done that would have helped the family in relation to the formal identification?
You said the time constraint created a challenge that didn't need to be there. What do you mean by that?
From that point of view of the time constraint, the post-mortem was going ahead at a set time. It started at 8 o'clock in the morning, and to get the information I required to then go and speak to the family to try and get that contact. And I respect the fact that they were taking consultation from a solicitor, and it turned out to be Mr. Anwar. But even in that short period of time, I would like to think I'd be confident of sorting something out that morning in relation to identification.
So do you feel that if you'd had the opportunity to speak with the family that morning, be it Caddy or Addie or Colette, then the misunderstanding around the identification of the body could potentially have come to light and some action been taken to allow the family to identify before the post-mortem took place?
Yeah, I'm confident that had I had that interaction and spoken to the family, I'm confident I would have resolved that issue. I'm also confident that, as I said earlier, if it was a case of that is the post-mortem is going ahead, then I would need something from the Crown Office to explain to the family. It would be unacceptable just to go and say, well, the Crown have said, that's it. I fully understand the Crown's position in relation to an investigation of a death in custody, but you still have to speak to the family. Is there a need for that to go ahead at that time? That was never explained to me, that it had to go ahead at that time.
And what was the barrier to you having that conversation with any member of the family on the morning of the 4th?
Making the phone call, and by the time the phone call was returned to me and a confirmation of who my contact was going to be, i.e. Mr. Anwar, by that time the post-mortem had started.
Were you concerned on the morning of the 4th that this combination of circumstances, this perfect storm of events, the timescale that you were working to, difficulty making contact with the family, was creating a situation where it was difficult for you to fulfil your responsibilities in terms of the policy?
Yes, the initiative had been lost.
What do you mean the initiative had been lost?
Making contact with the family and interacting with the family, obtaining more information. It's very important to speak to the family. As I said that probably earlier, that although I make your first contact as an introduction as to who you are, what your role is and how you'll assist the family moving forward, it's not uncommon for the family to say thank you very much, but I'll speak to you next week, or I'll speak to you tomorrow or next week. It's not for me to impose what I want to do. It's my job to manage their expectations and to manage their emotions, their anger, their frustration, and lack or poor communication only creates frustration.
And given the set of circumstances that presented itself to you, and given your concerns that these circumstances in combination with the timescale for the post-mortem were making it difficult for you to fulfil your responsibilities, did it occur to you to say to senior management, or indeed to the fiscal, hang on a minute here, it's 10:30, I'm not long on duty, I've just been briefed and appointed as the flow, I've not met the family yet, and if this post-mortem goes ahead at lunchtime, I will not have the opportunity to fulfil my responsibilities in terms of the policy, to speak to the family about the need for the post-mortem, to speak to the family about the need for identification or an alternative form of identification. Did it cross your mind on the 4th of May to have that conversation?
I guess I did want to have that conversation, but I didn't want to just go and say, I think we should be doing this. I wanted to have the information from the family to have a better picture, because the question that would be asked is why. So I would like to have had more information in relation to that. The timescales involved, I said the initiative had been lost as getting that information, I think, even if that had just been a phone call. And it wasn't until after my first meeting with the Addy that you had a better understanding of their emotion, their anger, their frustration, the different messages they'd received. All that was, as you say, it was a perfect storm. And the initiative had been lost on, I would say, on the Sunday rather than the Monday morning.
And with the benefit of hindsight, might it have been worthwhile having that conversation with senior management or with the fiscal on the Monday morning?
If I'd known the information, I wouldn't just go to them and say what's happening, because it was very much a case of the post-mortem was going ahead at lunchtime, and that's it, and the family have refused to do formal identification, and that was it.
Let's go back to page 26, please, of this PDF. There's a section headed Post-Mortem Examination. The flow will be required to explain the requirement for a post-mortem examination to establish a cause of death. The thought of such an examination can cause considerable distress to families, particularly where cultural or religious beliefs are contrary to such a process taking place. In such circumstances, flows must proceed with sensitivity, explaining the reasons for a post-mortem. Were you concerned by the lack of opportunity to discuss the requirement for the post-mortem with the family before it took place?
Yes.
What was your understanding of Mr. Bio's religion on the morning of the 4th?
I can't remember if it was that morning or until I'd spoken to, I'm sure I've got to mention him in my flow log somewhere, but I did find out he was Muslim.
Okay. Certainly on the morning of the 4th you would have known that he was a black man.
Yes.
Who was born in Sierra Leone.
Yes.
Did that raise in your mind the possibility that he might have been Muslim?
Yes.
And what steps did you take to ascertain whether the family wished any cultural or religious requirements to be observed in connection with the post-mortem? That
was one of the sort of priorities I had as well. At some point, whether that was through Mr. Anwar or through family contact, I can't remember exactly. But I did establish those circumstances. Again, from experience, I have had that experience of dealing with different religious beliefs and whether practicing that religion or not, and how will that impact on post-mortems, how will it impact on moving forward in relation to the identification of their loved one.
So you wanted to speak with the family about the need for the post-mortem to take place?
Oh, very much so, yes.
And you wanted to speak to them about the identification process,
yes,
to try to resolve the issue?
Yes, it was a priority for me as far as I was concerned.
It was a priority. And you also wanted to ascertain whether there were any religious or cultural
yes,
requirements
yes,
or observations. It's 10:30 in the morning, and these are your priorities. And the autopsy was due to take place, I'll be corrected if I'm wrong, but I think it was at midday. So the clock was ticking.
Yes.
And you have said in your evidence that you were concerned by that. Help me to understand why you didn't say to senior management or to the fiscal, just put the brakes on this. I need to speak to this family before this autopsy goes ahead.
Whether I specifically said that, but it's again, that's why I said I was going to Kirkcaldy, to stay up at Kirkcaldy, to get access, hopefully get physical access to the family, to establish that. And as you say, cultural beliefs, was it a cultural issue that had to be delayed, or to go back and just say, well, I would want more information to go back and have, and be able to explain my rationale on behalf of the family as to why can it be delayed.
Did it become apparent to you somewhere between 10:30 and midday that you just weren't going to get that information before the autopsy commenced, or that the likelihood of you being able to have that meeting with the family and then gather that information to allow you to make your case to senior management or the fiscal wasn't going to happen?
No, I was always hopeful of it. I don't remember the actual time being told it was 12 o'clock. I knew the post-mortem was going ahead in the afternoon, but I didn't have an exact time. But I was always hopeful of making contact with the family. Unfortunately, it didn't happen from a physical contact point of view, but that's why I was up there, to make that contact, to get that information.
Had you appreciated that the post-mortem was going to start at midday, would there have come a point somewhere between 10:30 and 12 o'clock when, if there was no contact from the family, if you hadn't had the opportunity to meet them, introduce yourself and talk to them about the post-mortem and identification and cultural and religious requirements, would there have come a point where you would have spoken to senior management about your concerns about the timescale and this post-mortem going ahead?
I think in hindsight, I could have gone back to them, but what was quite clear to me is that the post-mortem was going ahead. That was it, full stop. There was no information to me to say or suggest that there was a possibility of it being delayed. It was simply going ahead. That was it.
What was the hurry?
I have no idea.
Is that not something that you would have wanted to know?
It's not for me to decide when a post-mortem is going to be. It's for me to liaise with the family, and as you say, and as it says there, to pass on that information. I have to be honest, I was surprised that the post-mortem was going ahead on the Monday. I didn't expect it to be that day, but that's out with my control. I have no input in relation to that.
Was there any reason, to your knowledge, why it couldn't have been delayed if that request had been made?
Nothing that was explained to me.
Can we return to the flow log, please? And look at the next entry, which I think is page 13 on the PDF. This next entry is dated 4th of the 5th, 14:30 hours, so 2:30 in the afternoon. By this point, the autopsy has started. And if we could scroll up a little bit, please, just to see what this relates to. It's personal contact with DC Andy Mitchell and Wayne Parker. Let's read this entry, please. Meeting with the above officers, who were the first to attend and speak with the family after the incident with Police Scotland. Both have submitted full statements. They made contact and advised family of the death and that it was a critical incident to be investigated. They were later given a prepared statement to be read over verbatim to the family. This statement thereafter caused issues and complaints from the family about varying reports of the events. I'd like to ask you some questions about this. We see, if we scroll down just a wee bit, that this entry was written up at 4:15 in the afternoon of the 5th, so again more than 24 hours after the contact. This meeting with Mitchell and Parker, what did you understand that they had told the family about the circumstances of Shekabayo's death?
At that time, they referred to the notebooks and read out verbatim what they'd been told to say to the family.
Who was their meeting with?
The police officers?
Mm-hmm.
I can't remember if it was Colette or Addy.
Well, the inquiry has heard evidence that DC Mitchell and DC Parker gave Colette Bell the death message quite early in the morning of the 3rd of May and then took a statement from her. When I read you the chapter from her evidence earlier on, where she described not wanting to give the statement but giving it because she just wanted to see Sheku, that was a reference to the statement that she gave to DC Mitchell and DC Parker. And the inquiry has heard evidence that they gave an entirely separate death message, the one that was written down verbatim and read out verbatim from a notebook to Addy and Caddy later on that day. So I'm just keen to understand who they told you that they had spoken with when you had this conversation with them?
I can't. It may well have been Colette. I can't remember for definite. It was, and now that you say that, I do remember that they had been up before that and delivered a message, and then they had returned with this verbatim message. I can't remember what the first, because they'd already given statements in relation to that. I knew we had reference to it.
Did they discuss with you at that time any concerns the family may have raised around there being a racial element to Sheku's death?
No, I don't remember that.
There's a reference to varying reports of the events. What did you understand to be the nature of the complaints that had been made about these varying reports?
The different versions of events that had been delivered by different people to the family.
Can we move on to the next entry in the log, please? So 15:35 hours on the 4th, text message from Addy Johnson providing the mobile number of Amar Anwar solicitor and stating he would act on behalf of the family. Which family members did you understand that Mr. Anwar was acting on behalf of?
I'm acting on behalf of the family. That was my understanding.
So everybody?
Yes, that's referred to, as it says there, acting on behalf of the family. I take that as the family group.
And what effect did a solicitor acting on behalf of the family have on the way that you would go about communicating with the family going forward?
I don't know, how do you mean effect? What effect did it have?
Well, sorry, that's a poor question by me, but you've told us that Addy was the single point of contact, and I'm wondering when the single point of contact tells you that a solicitor is now representing the family or acting on behalf of the family, what difference does that make to the way that you go about liaising with the family directly? Would it mean, for example, that you would route all communications through the solicitor, or would you continue to work with a single point of contact for the family, or potentially both?
It was made quite clear from the very outset that communication had to be through Mr. Anwar, which wasn't a problem for me. It was I've had experience of that before as well. So if it meant me contacting Mr. Anwar on behalf of the family, that was fine. Ideally, from experience, I would have liked that contact with him, but a higher level of contact still being contained or being delivered by myself to the family, and keeping Mr. Anwar aware of what I was doing, the contact I was doing.
If we can look at the next entry, please. This is 1540 on the 4th of the 5th. Spoke to Amar, who confirmed previous entry, no issues. So when you say that Mr. Anwar confirmed the previous entry, i.e. that he was representing the family,
yes,
what did you understand that to mean in terms of who your contact should be with from that point onwards?
With himself.
If we can, before we go further, did you have a discussion with Mr. Anwar about your expectations of him, if all contact was going to be through him?
Specifically, no, I don't remember. It was basically I introduced myself to Mr. Anwar and what I expected to be doing on behalf of the family, and to keep him in the loop with any communications that we would have in the future. That was a kind of very much an initial contact with Mr. Anwar. I don't think it was a particularly lengthy telephone conversation, and that was, as I say, no issues. He was in agreement with that, so I had no issues with that.
Can we look at the next entry, please? (15:45 hours on the 4th). Telephoned Addy Johnson to confirm I'd received contact details for Amar Anwar. Addy requested a home visit at 18:30 hours, and you agreed to that home visit. So this entry demonstrates that even after Mr. Anwar was on the scene, as it were, and acting on behalf of the family, there was ongoing direct contact with family members.
Yes.
And we'll see that, would it be fair to say, as a pattern as we go through the log, that you continued to seek to make contact with the
Yes.
family directly. If we can just scroll down to the bottom, again, just to observe that this entry was also written up the following day, as with all of the preceding entries. And if we can move on to the next one. So here we have at 17:29 hours a courtesy call to advise Amar of the home visit. That would be to Addy.
Yes.
No issues. And again, if you scroll down to the bottom, let's see when that was written up at 16:30 the following day. That's a very precise time, 17:29 hours, and the entry was written up the following day. Did you check your phone to be sure as to the time of that call, or
Might have been, probably might have been from the phone, just checking.
is that the sort of information you would hold in your memory, or would you have made a note somewhere? Or
Long time ago, yeah, my memory was a lot better. Not so good now. I'd be writing just about everything down nowadays, but at that time, 17:29, yeah, I probably took that off my mobile phone, company phone.
let's look at the next entry. So the person contacted is Amar Anwar at 17:48 hours on the 4th of May. And again, if we can just scroll to the bottom for a moment, please, to note that this entry was written up at 16:45 the following day. Let's look at the content of this entry now. Advised Amar Anwar on result of PM, unascertained death subject to toxicology and brain tissue exam. As to the pathologist had been unaware at that time. At the time of the call, Amar had his children with him. Also asked if he could obtain GP details for the PIRC to obtain medical records of Sheku for pathologist. Now, I want to ask you a number of questions about this entry. Where did you obtain the results of the post-mortem from?
Bill Little gave me a phone call.
He called you?
Yes.
Okay. And is that not the sort of call that you would log in the flow log? I suppose it wasn't a contact with the family.
It wasn't contact with the family, it was an update from Billy as to what had happened. It would have been just before that, I think.
And we see that you made the call to Mr. Anwar at 17:48 hours.
Yes, that's correct.
And again, can you help us to understand how you were able to put such a precise time on that call, given that it was written up the following afternoon?
Again, that would be from probably from the phone, the mobile phone.
Now, there is a record of the timings of the post-mortem prepared. It's on PIRC-headed notepaper, and it's headed up Officer's Note, and presumably was prepared by one of the PIRC officers in attendance. Several individuals from PIRC were present at the autopsy. I'll see if we can get it up on the screen if we have it. It's PIRC 04148. No, we don't have it, and it may not matter. But what it says, and this is on the second page for anyone who wants the reference, third paragraph down, the post-mortem commenced at 1400 hours and was concluded at 1750 hours. So that tends to suggest, and it's a matter of minutes, but tends to suggest that the autopsy concluded after the call that you made to Mr. Anwar. But is it your evidence that the call would have been time-stamped on your telephone?
Yes.
And that's the time that you made the call? And you've advised that you heard from Billy Little. He'd phoned you shortly before you made the call to Mr.
Yes.
Anwar, and he told you the results of the post-mortem.
Yes.
Where were you when you made this call?
To Mr. Anwar, Kirkcaldy Police Office. Or out in the backyard away for privacy.
In the backyard?
Yeah.
Now, your deputy, Flo, John Clarkin, said that he was driving and that you were in the front passenger seat, and he thought that's where you were when the call was made.
No, I remember we may well have been driving at some point, but I remember it might well be just arriving back at Kirkcaldy Police Office. The exact times of been moving about, I don't know, because we were moving about quite a bit. But I do remember getting the phone call, or making the phone call, and I purposely stepped out into the backyard of the Kirkcaldy Police Office for privacy.
And the entry says, advised result of PM, unascertained subject toxicology and brain tissue exam. How did Mr. Anwar react to that information?
As it says there, he asked who the pathologist had been, and I told him I was unaware at that time.
Mm-hmm. And beyond asking about the pathologist, did he have any reaction to you sharing with him the result of the autopsy?
No.
You said in your second inquiry statement, we don't need to bring it up on the screen, but the reference would be paragraph 75. Anwar certainly didn't express any surprise when I told him the PM had been completed. There was no surprise.
That's correct.
You have recorded in the entry that at the time of the call, he had his children with him. How did you know that?
I could hear him in the background, and we had a bit of conversation about children and looking after them, etc. That was just a bit of professional courtesy between both of us.
Okay. And you say children rather than child. Were you able to tell how many children were with him?
Well, I could hear the children in the background, and I probably just said to him that is it a good time to speak to him, and he told me he was out with his children at the time, so, and it was okay to continue with the conversation.
Did he say where he was?
No, I don't think so.
Did you have an impression as to what he was doing with the children?
Me? Well, other than a father spending time with his children, no.
And why did you record in the flow log that he had his children with him? Why did you think that was a relevant detail that was worth noting down?
It was, I could hear in the background that the children were there, so I was just, as I say, I was making sure it was a safe environment to talk to him about these circumstances. That's all.
Okay, and it was at 17:48, which is after the end of the typical working day.
Yes.
Okay. And given that he had his children with him, and you said he was out somewhere with them, did you form any impression as to whether he was able to give you and the call of his full attention at that time?
Yeah, he said he could, so I wouldn't have continued the conversation. If he'd said phone me back, I would have done that, or he could have phoned me back.
You've recorded that you asked him to obtain the details of Mr. Bio's GP?
He had to obtain the medical records.
And how did he respond to that request?
Can't remember. I think he'd said he'd go back to the family. To be 100% certain, I couldn't be specific about that response.
Again, this entry was written up almost 24 hours later. Why wasn't it written up at the time or shortly afterwards?
There's no specific reason behind it. It was a suitable time to sit down for me at that time to write up the entry in relation to it. It's having the time to prioritise what you need to do and then prioritise what you write down, and taking that time to write it down.
Because this wasn't just one conversation that you were holding in your head. By the time you sat down with your notebook on the afternoon of the 5th, you were holding in your head information relating to the initial briefing and in relation to the meeting that you had with Mr. Little and Mr. Clarkin, where the flow strategy was discussed. And then there was an update in relation to, from Mr. Harrower, in relation to the identification of the body, and a further update on that the following morning. A discussion that you had with DC Mitchell and Parker, various messages around the appointment of Mr. Amara's family solicitors. That's a lot of information to be holding in your head and not to write up until approximately 24 hours later.
Yep, I appreciate that. Just the information was, as I say, at that time, I found relatively easy to recollect and sit down and take the time to do it. It's not a rush job. I made a point of finding a quiet place and just taking it, going day by day as to what I could recollect and put down the information into the flow log.
Now, in fairness to Mr. Anwar, he was invited to comment on this entry in your log. And we do this by a process that we call Rule 8 request. And I wonder if we can bring up his Rule 8 response now. So if we can scroll down, please, and I'll say when to stop. Sorry, that's my fault. Up a little bit. It's the bit in the box here. Did you receive a call from Mr. Lewis at 1748 on 3 May 2015? And this is Mr. Anwar's response. I had already been told on the 4th of May by the family that they wished the post-mortem to be put on hold, and Addy had told the PIRC that they wished it delayed until Mrs. Aminata Bayo had arrived and she had seen Sheku. In conversation with Alistair Lewis, this was reiterated by myself on the 4th of May that the PM would be on hold. For him to claim that he told me the post-mortem had gone ahead makes no sense. Now, I don't think you'll have seen this before.
No.
Take a moment, please, and when you've had the opportunity to digest that, I would invite your comment.
In relation to the first part, the family had told the PIRC that they wanted it put on hold. That goes back to well, excuse me, what I was told on the Monday that it was going ahead and that was the end of the matter. And in conversation with myself, he didn't reiterate to me that the PM would be put on hold. It was later that day, or later, maybe the following day, or a couple of days later, that he'd told me that the Lord Advocate had indicated that the post-mortem would be delayed. And I went back to that conversation, I went back to this phone call there, explaining the post-mortem and what I told him that day.
I think we'll see that as we work our way through the entries in the logs. Let's return to the log, please, and move on to the next entry, which I think is at page 19 of the PDF. Excuse me. "2015 hours on the 4th, phone call to advise the house at Arran Crescent is to be returned to the family by 2200 hours. Now, this is a contact at 2015 on the 4th. We have just looked at a phone call to Amar Anwar at 1758 hours, and if you take it from me, we'll come to it shortly, the next entry relates to a home visit at 1830 hours. So this one is out of sequence.
This one, yes, well, I'd need to look at it in sort of context.
Well, let's do that. Remember, you've got a hard copy of the flow log in front of you, but let's just look at the previous page for a moment, please. Previous page being the phone call to Amar. If we go to the top where we can see the time of that contact, so that's 1748 hours on the 4th. And then if we scroll down, the entry that we're about to look at relates to contact at 2015 hours on the 4th of the 5th. And if we scroll down for completeness to the next entry, it's dated 1830 on the 4th of the 5th. So it appears that the 2015 entry is out of sequence.
Yeah, it's out of sync, yeah.
Is there any particular reason for that?
No, I couldn't. Certainly that day, having met the family, the priority for them was to get, at that time they wanted the house back, and that was something that I sort of prioritised, having met them, to get back to and speak to Bella Little in relation to that. So it's simply just out of sync, that's all.
Okay. It might make more sense then if we look at the entry that relates to the home visit, and that might give some context to the entry that's out of sync that relates to the return of the house. So this entry relates to, we can scroll up a little bit further please so we can see the top of the page. It's personal contact with Addie Johnson and family, 1830 hours on the 4th of the 5th. Home visit as requested by Addie Johnson. Initially, this visit was as an introduction to Addie and to obtain a list of clothing required by the partner collect, as the house still secured by Police Scotland. Myself and John Clarkin then subjected to intense questioning by a large contingent of the family, occasionally hostile and frustrated about what Police Scotland had done or told the family differed from that of the PIRC. Eventually managed to speak to Addie at the front door and placate him and explain our role. He reiterated Amar Anwar would be contact with the family. Also obtained a list of clothing. Family requested a female officer recover articles from the house. Further explained Crown-directed role, report to the COPFS. I will continue to update the family. Maybe occasions I will not be able to answer questions as it may compromise any Crown decision. However, this is a very early stage of the inquiry and a significant amount of information and witness statements require to be obtained. So I'd like to ask you some questions about this entry. So the purpose of the visit, according to the entry, was an introduction to Addie, as well as to obtain a list of clothing. Now, if we can perhaps go back to the family liaison policy for a moment, at page 21 of the PDF. Perfect, sorry, down a bit. Lovely, thank you. Working and communicating with the family. The conduct of the first contact with the family is vital in laying the foundations for a successful partnership. Would you agree with that?
Yes.
At no time must a family be deliberately misled. Contact must be honest and, as far as possible, open. It is of paramount importance that families are treated appropriately, professionally, with respect and with consideration given to their needs. Investigators must never make assumptions as to the particular needs and expectations of a family. Again, would you agree with that?
Yes.
I want to ask you some questions about your preparation for this meeting with the family. It was at 6:30 on the 4th of May, so almost 36 hours after the events at Hayfield Road on the morning of the 3rd of May. And if we can look at page 21 again of the policy. That's perfect. Just down a tiny bit, please. Thank you. Stop there, please. 3 paragraphs down. One of the primary concerns of family members will be the need for information. The trauma of bereavement can be compounded by the frustration of not knowing the surrounding facts. The victim's family must be provided with the timely sharing of all possible information so far as the investigation permits. The flow should have direct communication with the SI in connection with their role and issues concerning the family. Any information released to the family must first be authorised by the SI. Now, you were aware from your discussion with DCs Mitchell and Parker that the family had raised issues and complaints about varying reports of the events. Should we understand that to mean the events at Hayfield Road, yes. What had happened to Shekabayo? Yes. And any family, I think it would be fair to say, who have lost a loved one following police contact will want to know what has happened. What did you do to inform yourself about what was known about the circumstances at that time?
The circumstances, my understanding was that it was just the 2 police officers who had contact with the family, and that was my information at the time. And the only other information I had out with that was from the briefing that day. So again, the priority of getting in contact with the family to get their version of events and understand their frustrations, because it already had been made aware to me by, I think, by the 2 police officers that the family were obviously frustrated about the different version of events. So I would like my opportunity there was to try and establish just exactly what had happened and their frustrations.
Okay. When you say you wanted to establish what had happened as far as the family were concerned, do you mean in terms of the contact that they'd had with officers from Police Scotland? The contact that they had had, and as I say, I was aware of the different versions of events that had been provided to them. Mm-hmm. And after the introduction, which is normal practice, is to introduce yourself and contact details, it was quite clear from the family that, and understandably, their anger and frustration to the different versions of events which they provided to me at that time, and their concerns about, one thing that sort of sticks out is that
they were under the impression that we had control of Aaron Crescent, whereas I'd been told it was Police Scotland's responsibility for that. We did not have control over that. So that, to me, was, well, where does that information come from to the family? And I need to clarify that, and how did that get there? And it's, it's difficult to establish that information in such a short space of time, but understanding theirs, and I do understand their anger and their frustration and the emotions. It is quite obviously, goes without saying, it is a traumatic situation that they're in.
So this was a family who had been provided with different accounts of the events at Hayfield Road.
Yes.
And this had led to anger
Yes.
and frustration.
Yes.
So what did you do to inform yourself about what was known of the circumstances at that time?
Again, from speaking to the police officers and reviewing what we had, or the information, remembering the information I had in relation to the briefing paper, again, it goes back to, I would have preferred to be in earlier to speak to the family and establish their side of or get more detail from what they'd been told.
There are two separate issues here, I think. There's the family's concerns and complaints that they'd been provided with different accounts, and there's their need for the truth. There's their need to understand what happened on the morning of the 3rd of May at Hayfield Road. What did you do to gather information that might assist the family beyond going back to your briefing note?
Well, so my priority was to speak to the family to clarify what they had been told and get more information in relation to that.
At this point in time, I'm not concerned with what the family have been told. I'm concerned with questions the family might have wanted to ask you about what had happened to Sheku. Because the briefing note, you will recall, says that the officers who attended Hayfield Road saw him in possession of a knife approaching them. They drew their batons and spray. A struggle then ensued. And you've given evidence that you understood that to be accurate. It must surely have occurred to you before you went to meet with this family, knowing as you did that they'd been provided with different versions of events and that they were angry and frustrated as a result of that, that they would want you to tell them what had happened to their loved one.
That's correct, and I agree with that. And the information that I had at that time from the briefing and from the police officers, that was my information at that time.
And I understand from the policy that any information that a FLO can make available to a family about the circumstances of an incident has to be approved in advance by the senior investigating officer.
Yes.
Is that right? So what discussions did you have with the senior investigating officer about the information that you could give to the family when you met with them about the circumstances of Shekubayo's death?
I can't remember if I spoke to Bill Little directly, but there certainly was, before I spoke to the family in conversation with Billy, apart from the update in relation to the post-mortem result, there was no other information to confirm or deny the information that we already had at that time. So what I had at that time was information, as far as I was concerned, was accurate and to go to the family with.
And what you had at that time was that the officers on arrival at Hayfield Road saw Mr. Bai in possession of a knife approaching them. They drew batons and sprays and a struggle ensued.
That was the information I had, yes.
And did you have authority from the senior investigator to share that information with the family as the events as you understood them at that point in time?
That was the information I had. The authority to get specific authority, but I didn't. That was information I had, so there was no specific guidance or authority to provide information, but it was information I had at the time. In fairness, from the family's point of view, it was quite clear from the first interaction that their anger and frustration was about that information and the different versions of events that they had. I do remember Adi giving me 2 or 3 different versions of events, and that was more information that I had obtained from the family than I did through the police investigation or our own information at that time. So again, that was information being clarified by the family, if you like, as to what they had been told.
When you went to see the family, did they ask you, tell us what happened?
They wanted to know what happened.
Mm-hmm. And did you share with them the information that you've recorded in your full log that was provided to you at the briefing?
Can't remember if I went into that detail, because there was the anger was they wanted to know the right information and they wanted access back to Aaron Crescent. So that was and the list that they required was a priority for them at that time as well. So the plan was to go, or my plan then was to go back and provide that information to Bill Little and to get clarification about releasing the house.
You said the family wanted the right information. Did you have any concerns about the accuracy of what you'd written down following the briefing?
I never take, again, it's a briefing paper, so I would never take, until somebody had told me it is 100% accurate, I would just assume, or wouldn't assume, but I would take that as a briefing paper and that our investigation. That's all the questions that the family were asking me at the time were all questions that, as a flow and as an investigator, and as part of the investigation itself, were all part of that investigation. How did that information get, or those different versions of events get to the family, and what caused those different versions of events?
And did you provide this version of events to the family?
I don't specifically remember giving that version of events because it was quite clear that they'd already received multiple versions of the events. So I personally don't remember giving that information to aggravate the situation because, again, it would be another version of events.
And did you know by the time of your visit that Shekobayo had not, in fact, been in possession of a knife?
At the time of the home visit? No, I wasn't aware of that.
Can we look at page 19 of the family liaison policy, please? Perfect, thank you. Second paragraph from the top. The flows must meet with the family as soon as is reasonably practicable after deployment. Before meeting with the family, the flow will, and then there's a list of bullet points. I want to ask you about two of them. The third bullet point down says, establish the extent of previous police contact with the family since the incident or death. And beneath that, establish what information has been passed to the family prior to their deployment, to whom and by whom. What did you do to establish what information had been passed to the family before you went to this meeting with the family?
Speaking with the two police officers, my information was that they were the only officers that had spoken to the family.
Okay. And did you take any steps to establish whether any other officer had had contact with the family? At
that point, my information was that was it. That was the two police officers who had spoken to the family. I don't think it was until I actually spoke to Addy. It was Addy and Caddy who informed me that Mr McEwen, and they described it, I think, as a female chief inspector, had been up. But at that, when my information, that was news to me when I arrived.
Can we look at your second statement, paragraph 71, please? I've been shown my PIRC statement which records that at 1600 hours I attended a Police Scotland Gold meeting chaired by Assistant Chief Constable Nicholson. At this meeting, Chief Superintendent Gary McEwen expressed concern that the family of Shekobayo were unhappy with PIRC and their lack of contact. I expressed my surprise as I had spoken to Addy Johnson and had a positive call. I was walking through Kirkcaldy Police Office when Gary McEwen came out and said, "Are you from PIRC? Can you sit in on this meeting?" Which I did without any issues. And that is when he says there, he mentioned that the family were not happy about the PIRC, and I could not understand that because it was a positive telephone conversation I'd had. It says there I had spoken to Amar Anwar to introduce myself to him, and I think I suggested to him that it was important I spoke to Addy, which he agreed with. I think it was either 6 or 6:30 that night that Addy would be available, and then we had this Gold Group meeting and I was surprised by his comments. I asked what was his reason for thinking that, and he basically said he had spoken to the family. At that time, I did not know he had spoken to the family, or had been to visit the family on that day along with Nicholas Shepherd, Chief Inspector at the time. I had no knowledge of that meeting. Had he expressed or told me that he had been there at a physical meeting with the family, I would have spoken to him before meeting Addy and the family. Can we scroll up a little bit, please? Stop, please. I asked, this is 4 lines from the bottom, I asked what was his reason for thinking that, and he basically said he had spoken to the family. So were you aware before you went to the Johnson's house that Gary McEwen had spoken with the family?
Yeah, that would be correct. I took that as a telephone call to the family.
And why didn't you ask him about it?
In hindsight, yeah, I should have asked him for more information in relation to that. Prior to speaking, it was, as I say, it was Adi that gave me more information about that visit.
And from the point of view of you informing yourself as to what contact police officers had had with the family in advance of your meeting, did it make any difference really whether Gary McEwen had spoken to the family over the phone or in person?
Yes, it would, yes, it would have made a difference. It could have probably given me more information about what he had spoken to the family about.
But it's still a contact with the family.
Yes,
And
yeah.
without asking further, you wouldn't know whether it was a
That's
personal
correct,
contact or a phone call or the length of that contact or what was exchanged during that contact.
I think I was more, sort of, I wouldn't say taken aback, but surprised that he was telling me that the family were not happy with the PIRC, and that's my response was that I couldn't understand that because I'd had what was a positive telephone conversation with Adi. So in hindsight, yes, I probably should have probed it with more detail. That was, to me, that was just, it was a phone call, and he was passing on the family's discontent with the PIRC.
Okay. And how would it have helped you to have known in advance about his meeting with the family?
Yeah, it would have been, well, from what Adi told me, it would have been beneficial to have known Mr McEwen's version of events.
Thank you. So I'm going to move on. I wonder if this is a convenient point to adjourn.
Very well. Now, Mr. Lewis, we'll continue your evidence on Wednesday of next week. The inquiry will hear the evidence of Mr. Little tomorrow and on Tuesday. The inquiry will now adjourn.